Okay, good evening and welcome everybody. It is 6 o'clock, so we will make a start. This is a meeting of Calderdale Council's Cabinet, which has been arranged specifically to discuss item 6 relating to devolution. Present we have the, on the screen, you should be able to see if you're watching this remotely, the 6 Cabinet members. That's myself, Councillor Swift, Councillor Metcalfe, Councillor Susan Press, Councillor Jane Scullion and Councillor Wilkinson. We also, and Councillor Patient, dear me, I'm not doing well with Zoom this evening. And we also have a number of other councillor members who, from other groups, who've asked to attend, and I think wanted to have indicated they wish to speak on particular items. Have Councillor Baines, Councillor Lee, Councillor Evans, and we may have Councillor Carter joining us, I think. Plus officers Ian Hughes and Nigel Broadbent, and Kirsty Smith, who's making sure the technology works for us all. That's panicked her. So, and I hope we do better than the first Cabinet meeting when my broadband decided to crash out at least twice during the meeting. So item I'm just finding my agenda on the other screen. So item 1, there are no apologies for absence. Item 2, members' interests, is to remind members of the need to declare any disclosable pecuniary interests or other interests. Item 3, admission of the public. It's not recommended that the public be excluded for any of the items on this meeting. Item 4 is the minutes of the Cabinet meeting held on the 27th of April. These have been circulated as part of the agenda pack. Could I ask Cabinet colleagues if there are any comments or amendments or corrections to the minutes? In that case, if I propose that they're a correct record, could I can see you all on screen, so could I ask you all to indicate if you're happy to agree those?
It's a second, Chair.
Thank you. Seconded by Councillor Scullion and approved. Thank you. Item 5 is question time, which, as you know, we're doing slightly differently whilst we're online. I've had notice of one question from a member of the public, which I'll ask Councillor Hughes or Kirsty. I think probably Councillor Hughes. Dear me, it's been a long day, obviously. Too many Zoom meetings. I'll ask Ian Hughes to read that out. Then I did get notice of a question from Councillor Evans. I did notice it was after 2 o'clock, Councillor Evans, but as I'm in a generous mood tonight, I will take it. So Ian, is it you that has the question from Mr. Ray?
It is, Leader, thank you. It's in 2 parts related to the same matter. I'll read both questions out at the same time. It's from Anthony Ray. Leeds Bradford Airport has submitted a planning application to Leeds City Council to expand it to 7 million passengers per annum by 2030, which would increase its climate emissions to almost 500,000 tonnes a year. Is it the case that Calderdale is still part of the arrangement whereby the 5 West Yorkshire councils hold a special share interest in the airport to protect the airport's continued operation? And if so, will it use its rights as share owner to publicly protest about the proposed expansion and its threat to our response to the climate emergency, and urge the other West Yorkshire councils to do the same? Leader, that's the first question. The second question from Mr. Ray is, as I said, linked, and it's as follows. The Transport Committee of the West Yorkshire Combined Authority is promoting and proposing to fund the provision of a new link road from a proposed Parkway rail station to the airport, upon which the Leeds Bradford Airport planning application is relying. Will Calderdale Council challenge and oppose this proposal until such time as the airport has stopped attempting to expand its emissions and has instead committed to reducing them in the same way as every other business in Leeds City region is required to do?
Okay, thank you. As as always with Mr. Ray's questions, they not only raise some interesting points of principle, but also have quite a lot of detail in. And for that reason, particularly the first point about the golden share and what can and cannot be done about that, I think it's quite important to provide a written response and make sure we get that accurately. Similar to the second one, I think the question about whether you should link how people get to the airport, which may involve reducing carbon emissions with the expansion. Again, one just want to make sure we get the lines right on. I think what I would say generally is that, you know, both Calderdale Council and West Yorkshire Combined Authority have declared a climate emergency. We both have plans for a timeline to move to a zero carbon economy. And I think we'd want to make sure that whatever is done around the airport is consistent with that and doesn't simply lead to an increase in emissions. So we'll make sure those points are captured and provide a fuller written response on that one. I think that was the only public question. And then we had a question from Councillor Evans, who needs to unmute himself.
Yes, I think I'm done. Am I speaking? Yeah, do you want me to read the question out? I sent it. Yeah, okay.
Yeah,
my question was return to school. Whilst I'm inclined to agree with the Cabinet's decision not to require junior and infant schools in Calderdale to increase the number of pupils they teach in line with central government's edict, I'm very disappointed by the lack of discussion and consultation before making the decision. Head teachers tell me that the decision was made in advance of school cluster consultations with the local authority. Furthermore, I'm not aware of any consultation with other political groups within the authority either. Can Cabinet Ministers members assure me that this will not continue as and when we review the decision, when hopefully the pandemic and Calderdale's R number declines? So basically it's about the consultation on that particular subject.
Thank you. So for a bit of context, we discussed and issued some guidance to schools earlier this week about opening for 1st of June and why we were advising them that we felt that was premature. As the guidance from schools came out quite late, the guidance from government, the detailed guidance from government was quite late, and schools were pressing for a response. We took that decision quite quickly and issued it to schools and publicly as quickly as possible. I won't say a lot more about that at this point. I'm a little surprised about the comment in terms of schools and not consulting, because I am aware, I'll bring Councillor Wilkinson in to stand on this, but I am aware that there was quite a lot of contact with heads about it. And my understanding is the overwhelming reaction from heads has been supportive of the advice the council's given. But I don't know, Adam, if you want to add anything.
Yes, I accept that there was no consultation with other political groups, but there was extensive discussions with head teachers. In fact, many of them actually contacted the council themselves looking for guidance and advice. We did want to issue that guidance, that advice as quickly as possible, but rather than making any knee-jerk decisions, we did feel it was important to thoroughly review all the evidence we had, and in particular, seek legal advice and the opinion of our Director of Public Health, both of which were received on Monday, and we issued the guidance, our own opinion and advice then the following day as soon as possible. Obviously, it's half term tomorrow, as of tomorrow, and so we were under particular pressures in order to get that advice out so that schools had time to make their own decisions, because ultimately the ultimate decision rests with each head teacher, make the necessary arrangements and inform parents all before tomorrow, which is half term. So we appreciate your support as a group on this issue, and I think I speak for all Cabinet members when I say we'll try to consult and inform other groups as much as possible during this pandemic. But as I've outlined, there were particular time pressures in this particular case. When I last looked and reviewed the responses that we'd actually had from head teachers, over 90% of the responses were positive. And of the 3 that were negative, 2 of them were negative because they said they hadn't received enough notice of the decision. And I think that really just underlines the time pressures that we were faced with.
I think again, Councillor Evans will capture some of that in a written report, and perhaps also it's worth noting. I believe the government's indicating they may publish their scientific evidence or view on the scientific evidence tomorrow. So we'll look with that with interest, and then obviously going forward, look at the implications of that for Calderdale schools. But of course, that was not the only factor, and we also look with interest for more detail on the test and trace proposals. So that's the 2 questions that I've been given notice of. So I'll move us on now to the main item for the agenda, which is item 6, the proposals on devolution. And again, I ask people to bear with me because I just want to find it, bring it up on my screen alongside. So to give a little background of this, and if there's detailed questions about the legalities on this, I will look to Ian to help me out with this one. I think everybody's already aware that as it feels like an awfully long time ago, but as part of the budget announcement in March, the government announced that we'd agreed with them a city deal, devolution deal for covering the 5 West Yorkshire authorities. This has been a very long process getting to this point. There's been a number of different offers and proposals. We put forward what we felt was a pretty comprehensive proposal for a wider Leeds City region deal in 2015, which the government eventually turned down in 2016. And there's since then been a number of proposals, particularly around the possibilities of some form of wider footprint, and people may refer to the One Yorkshire proposals, for example. The deal that's eventually been agreed, really does bring substantial benefits to the West Yorkshire area as a whole. It is the largest devolution deal that's been agreed, with £38 million a year of gain share funded. That's unrestricted funding, 75% of which is revenue, which we think was a particularly good result. Announced alongside it a substantial allocation from the Transforming Cities Fund, access to a new fund for supporting the development on brownfield sites, the opportunities to access future transport funding. There was an announcement about flood funding, although some of us feel that probably largely confirmed things we thought had already been agreed. But as we know from the way that the city deal process works, that mayoral combined authorities are in pole position when it comes to future funding arrangements, and the Transforming Cities Fund was a good example of that previously, where those authorities already had a mayoral combined authority receive specific allocations, whilst areas such as West Yorkshire had to put in separate bids. And indeed, as part of the agreement, the government did agree that they would start to treat West Yorkshire as a mayoral combined authority already, and that has been important in that a representative from the combined authority has been included in some of the discussions with national government ministers about the economic recovery from COVID. So it's good to see that happening as agreed. What this paper does is set out the process that now needs to go through in terms of considering and agreeing the governance arrangements that are coming into place and agreeing the consultation process for that. Government is keen, as are we, that this goes ahead with the agreed timeline, with a mayor elected and in place for May 2021, and more importantly, with the funding that goes with it available to spend on priorities. And I think that's particularly going to be important now in the light of the impact of COVID. Hence the urgency of getting this agreed so we can keep to the timeline and get the consultation process started. So what I'd like to do is I will check whether any Cabinet colleagues have any questions or comments on this. I've then had noticed that both Councillor Evans and Councillor Lee have points they want, well, other way around, Councillor Lee first and then Councillor Evans have points and questions they want to raise on this, and I'll check if there's any wider points. So Cabinet colleagues first, does anybody have anything they want to add? Yeah, Councillor Scullion.
Thank you, Chair. More comments rather than questions. I've been, like the leader, in lots of Zoom meetings today, and one of them was about business innovation and growth. 92,000 businesses roughly across the West Yorkshire City region. And amongst the projects that we're doing at the moment is a reboot skills project of trying to get digital training for people who are on furlough at the moment, so that they're more employable coming out of that should their job no longer exist. And that's the kind of thing we're already doing at the West Yorkshire level. And we've been working with the Combined Authority and colleagues there really for quite some time. And I think the government recognising the value of that working together is very important. For me, there are two things that are particular, apart from the skills issue. One is the releasing of money for brownfields. We know that in Calderdale, post-industry has left us with lots of brownfield sites that are just too expensive to develop either for the council or developers. That is extremely welcome. And I think the other thing is actually what you referred to in terms of the shift to being with a begging bowl, bidding for project and then another project and then another, to having a mayoral status, which gives us an expectation of some of those government monies coming to us by right, as it were, in the way that Greater Manchester, London and Birmingham have, I think puts us in a better position post-COVID-19, post the pandemic, to be able to try and rebuild our economy in particular. Thank you.
Thanks, Jane. Any other? I'm not seeing any other Cabinet members at the moment, so I'll go to Councillor Lee next.
Can you hear me? Hello?
Yeah. Yes, we can hear you.
You can hear me?
Yes.
Oh, good. Thank you, Chair. I've just got three things that I want to mention. They are sort of questions, but they're observations as well. And the three things are costs, mayoral powers, and the survey. And if I can just take them one at a time. The first one on costs. I understand that there could be a mayoral levy, a deputy mayor's levy, and I think probably throughout, well, most of West Yorkshire, there's bid contributions that businesses make, and I don't know if there's a business support levy. So my question, and I don't necessarily expect an answer to these now, is I think that these will be questions that people will be asking. Just how much could this mayoral system cost people and businesses? Look like they could be hit with some costs. So that would be constructive, I think, if we could provide the answers to those questions before people go off in the wrong direction. I don't know.
We seem to have lost you for a moment, Councillor Lee. Okay, perhaps perhaps it might be helpful, although I'm a bit concerned Councillor Lee won't hear the answer, just to pick up that point first, because I think it mixes up, raises a couple of different things. I mean, I'm going to bring in and double check that I'm right, but I mean, it is the case that like all mayors, the mayor will have the ability to levy an additional business rate precept, I think it is, for infrastructure work, but there is quite a specific process for that. What I can't recollect and struggling to flick through the papers whilst I'm controlling the meeting, is whether there's a cap on that. Ian, can you comment on that?
Leader, thank you. The scheme proposes that the mayor prepares a draft budget, and it sets out how that budget is to be funded, including business levies, etc., or indeed a precept. That budget, that draft budget, is then subject to a very rigorous review process, which includes a requirement actually for it to be approved by the combined authority, which is obviously a separate entity from the mayor. At this stage, no decisions have been made as part of the scheme with regard to the precise funding model, and the extent, in fact, to which any additional funding may be needed from the constituent local authorities. And that will be determined by the combined authority when it considers the funding package that's available to it, and any new resources that are unlocked by the mayoral deal.
Thank you, Stephen. Stephen, I'm glad to see you back with us. I thought I'd get
Yes, I'm so sorry about
that's
that.
all right. I thought I'd get Ian to pick up that first point whilst you were working with the technology, if that's okay. I think you had a couple of other points.
If Ian was talking about the costs, I can speak to him tomorrow to get that answer back and talk about it.
Yeah.
But before it went off, I don't know when it went off, but you get the gist of it, that there could be potential costs that people will be concerned about. The second point was mayoral powers. I understand that different mayors, existing mayors, have various different powers. And I wonder if definite decisions have yet been made about what the powers of our mayor will be. And I'm including things that I think are unresolved, I'm not sure, such as fire and rescue, police and crime commissioner, and I understand that health isn't included in our deal, but I think it is in Manchester. So it's the ambit of the mayor's role that I'm interested in, and I think people would want to know about that beforehand. And I'm very interested in political balance and scrutiny arrangements. And as I said at the meeting last night, you know, I believe in the mayoral system. It's bringing lots of money into us. I'm interested in trying to get the very best deal of all politicians that can have an influence on scrutiny boards, and trying to provide a political balance to do the best for Calderdale. So do we know what the total responsibility of the mayor will be yet?
Yeah, thank you, Stephen. I'll start and then let Ian correct me if I get it wrong or add the details. On the big picture, when we were negotiating this deal, the government said that their ambition was to level up so that all the combined authority mayors had equivalent set of powers, with the exception of health, which you mentioned. So the intention is that the mayor will take over the role of the police and crime commissioner. There is still a slight dialogue about when that happens. The original intention, of course, would have been that there would have been an election for the police and crime commissioner in May 2020, and that person would then have served 4 years, and the mayor would take over those powers in 2024. With the mayoral election having been delayed, with the PCC election having been delayed for a year, the government would prefer the mayor to have police and crime powers immediately. The PCC has made some representations to the Home Office about that, not so much in terms of his own role, but in terms of a number of issues which he believes would require longer to transfer, and we're waiting for the Home Office's response to that. So the mayor will definitely have police and crime powers at some point, but it's not yet clear whether that will be 2021, 2022 or 2024. When that happens, obviously the role of the police and crime commissioner will disappear, and the mayor will appoint a deputy mayor with specific responsibility for policing. Fire and rescue is not included, and I think that's part of a wider debate nationally about whether it makes sense to combine fire and rescue with the police or not, and that is one thing that's different. Generally, most of the other powers proposed are the same. The actual exercise of those powers, the governance scheme around it, is quite complicated. So there are certain powers, such as policing and such as some of the transport powers, which are directly exercised by the mayor. There are some powers which are held by the combined authority, with the mayor, one vote, and occasionally with the veto in there. And these are set out in some detail in there. I don't know, Ian, is there anything you want to add to that?
Thanks, Leader. The position you've set forward on the PCC is exactly correct. There remains a debate about when exactly those powers will be transferred, but they will be transferred to the mayor. The scheme that is included as an appendix to this report is a very thorough document setting out the proposals for the functions of the combined authority as a mayoral combined authority. And on page 14 of that scheme, under section 3, there is an overview given of the functions to be exercised by the mayor. And they include transport, which is a power to draw up a local transport plan and strategies, housing and planning, land acquisition powers to support housing regeneration infrastructure, and powers to designate a mayoral development area. There are finance powers, which we touched on a moment ago with regard to the levying of a precept possibly, and charging of a business rate supplement, and then the PCC powers. So those are set out in the scheme. And it's important to note for members that the scheme that is to be consulted upon, subject to Cabinet this evening approving to undertake and sanction that exercise, that scheme, subject to any comments on the consultation process, is the one which will be transferred through to an order, which will be subject to parliamentary legislation. So it's the scheme that's the very important document which sets out the proposal, and it's the one that will, subject to any further comment made as part of the consultation, be transferred into the order, which would then give the powers to both the mayor and to the combined authority. And as I said, that's on page 14 and 15 as far as the mayoral functions are concerned in the scheme, which is Appendix 3 to this report.
Thank you. And did you have another point, Stephen? Sorry, you're on mute at the moment.
It's about the consultation and the survey that's going to be going around to people. This is a very, very important subject, as we all know, but I don't think it generates a tremendous amount of interest, probably with the public, but also amongst councillors to some extent. And I'm concerned about the survey. We're in the middle of the pandemic, as everybody knows, and it's quite an ambitious programme to get the mayor elected in May next year. So this 8-week period of the consultation, I'm concerned that we'll get an acceptable response. And my question on this is, has it been set out what an acceptable response would be? Yeah, it would be awful if it wasn't supported and people didn't express much of an interest, because it's so fundamentally important. I think that during the present situation, that might be the case. And I'm interested in Councillor Swift's comments on that.
Okay. This came up to some extent in the combined authority meeting this morning, which agreed the same paper in terms of the process, and we are still working. Combined authority is still working and engaging with some advice to try and get the the widest circulation as possible. I think, although obviously if we're in different circumstances, we probably would offer some sort of drop-in events or public meetings. I understand the feedback from other areas is that in reality, most of the responses to the consultation in other places where there's been mayoral combined authorities created have come online, and have tended to be quite heavily from business, because they've looked at on the one hand, the opportunities in terms of the investment, but on the other, a few of them, as you say, the concerns in terms of a potential levy. So I think, you know, we will aim to get the best possible coverage and advice. There's talk about doing a little bit of sort of targeted, again online, but sort of focus group type work to try and make sure there's some cross-cutting views expressed as well. There isn't, the legislation requires a consultation. It doesn't, as far as I understand, it doesn't particularly set a standard for what the outcome of that is. Because in the case of South Yorkshire, the consultation itself became a matter of considerable, well, ultimately of legal challenge, but I think that was a very different set of circumstances. Ian, is there anything you'd like to add on this?
Thanks, Leader. I think it's important also to recognise that the responses to the consultation, and that it will be as wide as possible, taking into account the limitations that we're under at the moment because of the coronavirus issue. And those are set out, councillors, at paragraph 7.4 of the report, which give a list of the ways in which consultation responses are to be obtained, as wide as possible through various methods, including potential local radio and television advertising. The responses to that consultation will go to the Secretary of State to be considered. Now, constituent councils can endorse or recommend the responses that are received, but ultimately it's for the Secretary of State to consider those consultation responses and any endorsement that's attached to them by the constituent councils, depending on Cabinet's assessment of the validity or otherwise of those responses. So the process is hoped to be as thorough a process as possible, and to ensure that all responses and all summaries of those responses are sent through as part of the submission of the scheme, again subject to Cabinet in September deciding that that's the appropriate course of action. The consultation period was extended from 6 weeks, or the initial 6 weeks consideration, to 8 weeks, to take into account the difficulties that are experienced by all councils at the moment to seek views of constituents. But it is hoped that the methods that are proposed in the report are ones that do capture as much interest as possible.
Thanks for that, Stephen, because it is an important point. I'm then going to go to Councillor Evans, who asked in advance, and then I'll bring in Councillor Carter and Councillor Baker, and then hopefully we'll have covered most of the points. Ashley. Sadly, Ashley, you're muted.
Am I working now? Yes. Good. A number of points which I was going to raise have been raised by Councillor Lee. I wanted to make a general point of saying that I was disappointed in the devolution because I'm very much a Yorkshire Parliament person, but perhaps this will move in that sort of direction eventually, and it's a step in the right direction maybe. My 2 points were really talking about the importance of councillors getting involved in the consultation process and supporting that consultation process, recognising it's important and taking on board a number of the issues which have been raised in terms of how effective it can be and will be. I think it's heading in the right direction, but I suppose at this point I'm just urging councillors to get involved in that and help make the process work as well as they possibly can and be positive about it. My specific question was about are Cabinet members confident that the devolution will not be excessively Leeds-centric? Having sat on the scrutiny board on a couple of occasions and seen those sorts of issues, recognising that we are probably one of the smaller authorities in the area, certainly the smallest authority in the area, and are we going to get our fair share of benefits from all of this and have the right level of influence? And I think part of that will need to come through the scrutiny support and process. So really it's just making the most for Calderdale out of all of this and how we can be sure of that.
Thanks very much, Ashley. On the wider issue of devolution, I mean, should these deals be called devolution at all? What we're talking about is a city deal for West Yorkshire, and that is what the government are offering, and that's what we've achieved. And I think it's the right thing to do to go for this, because it has the potential to bring extra resources into West Yorkshire, and it has the opportunity to make sure that the decisions about those are taken more locally than if they were taken in Whitehall. So I think it is a step in the right direction. We could have a lengthy debate about what is and isn't devolution, and perhaps that might be one for another day, frankly. You'll be aware there was talk about a one Yorkshire deal. I could see some merits in that, but I always had some personal concerns about the idea of a single elected mayor for the whole of Yorkshire, and I noticed you talk about a Yorkshire Parliament. I think in terms of city deals, if you look at the parallel with Scotland, and people have made the point that Yorkshire probably has a bigger economy than Scotland. Scotland has both a devolved assembly and city deals, because still recognise that there is that issue about the wider economic area around a city, which brings to the second point. Yes, Leeds is hugely important in terms of West Yorkshire economically and socially. I think I would argue it is not quite the dominant voice in the way that perhaps Manchester is in Greater Manchester, because of course Bradford is also a very substantial city in its own right. And if you look at travel links, for example, in West Yorkshire, it is not simply a case of Leeds at the centre and a hub coming outwards. In fact, most of the people from Calderdale who commute out of Calderdale for work go to Bradford or Kirklees, not to Leeds. And similarly, we have substantial flows in the other direction. Indeed, perhaps one of the important long-term pieces of work that's going on at the moment, which is the West Yorkshire transport connectivity work. You know, we've been making precisely that argument, and it has shifted substantially to a position where it is not simply looking at how you get to Leeds, but is looking at what needs to be done to improve those circular routes around the combined authority. And I'd say, you know, our track record so far of punching above our weight, I think, is very clear. I think Councillor Scullion will tell you that occasionally on the investment panel she hears members from other councils saying not another scheme for Calderdale. But, you know, we need to keep that up. And I think the important thing is that we continue to make a really strong case about why investment in Calderdale is important. And of course, in the combined authority context, why actually it's in the benefit of the whole of West Yorkshire for each of the 5 districts, including Calderdale, to thrive. I think we all fulfil different roles in terms of our contributions to the wider West Yorkshire economy, and it's really important that's recognised. But of course, we need to keep making our case on that, and it's a good point. Councillor Carter.
Thanks, Chair. I guess out of all of us sat in this room, I might be the only one that's actually lived the majority of my life in either 2 or 3 tier situations within this area. And I've always been used to urban district councils and the West Riding, or urban district or parish councils, Calderdale Council and West Yorkshire, because up until I think it was into the 90s, we had West Yorkshire County Council that used to administer some of the stuff that we did as Calderdale Council. And then we've had the combined authority. So I guess I'm used to all these different tiers of local government, and I quite welcome the new the elected mayor, to be honest with you, because I think I'm bringing this devolution and all this finance into West Yorkshire, I think is a good idea. So I'm not against devolution, I'm not against an elected mayor, and I'm not against some of the powers being in a different place than us having them, because I think it'll bring in more money and more centralised stuff and more some stuff that is if I say better managed, it sounds as though I'm being disrespectful, and I'm not meaning it in that respect. The more that you've got, the more use you can make of it. So if you've got a bigger pot of money, you can make more beneficial use of it, rather than having a small pot of money that you're trying to scramble about with. And I think that's the point I'm trying to make. However, and this comes the crunch bit, I didn't listen into the Zoom meeting at the Combined Authority this morning, because only being a substitute on audit, I just felt that really that was not my role. But one of the things that does concern me, and I think this was an opportunity to take that one step forward. When we did have the West Riding and we did have West Yorkshire County Council in the 70s and late 70s and 80s, all these members that sat on those were elected, as we are elected, as our town and parish councillors elected. And the issue for me with the combined authority is that election process is not there. And it won't be there going forward, except for the elected mayor. And the problem I've got is what I raised yesterday, and it doesn't change. Is the lack of representation that Calderdale has. This is not about party politics. This is about numbers, and that is my only concern. I would have loved to have seen in this paper a mechanism of saying we have 5 authorities in West Yorkshire, let each of them have 2 representatives, however they wish to choose that in some respects, but make sure it's done make sure there is a little bit of cross-party involvement. And so there is some cross-party involvement, because when you're the mayor of the borough, you always realise that whenever you have a procession, you always come at the end, because you're always the littlest. So you come at the end, always at the end, always at the back, and you're always first out. So it's as if, so Councillor Scullion's laughing at me, but it's fact. We're always that thing at the end, and we can never change that because we're the smallest authority. And it just feels sometimes as though, you know, you're just not there. You're only there making up the numbers. And I passionately believe that the people of Calderdale, those 210,000 and then whatever the number was at the end that I forgot to write down yesterday, actually have a big impact in West Yorkshire. And we should be really concerned about them in among all this. And why shouldn't they have the same representation as the other West Yorkshire authorities? And I just wish that these papers are given that more flexibility of membership. And I'm really disappointed that they haven't. And this is not about politics with a capital P. This is about the process of representation and democracy. And that's where I'm coming from in that little bit. It's about giving the people of West Yorkshire, of Calderdale, the best support that we can possibly do as elected members in this wider field. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. I'll bring in Ian in a moment just to talk about a little bit about some of the fine grain about that. I think 1 or 2 points I'd make. We took a conscious decision that we would keep cross-party representation on the main combined authority. So in some combined authorities, the membership of the combined authority is simply the leader of the relevant councils. So there has been a point in Greater Manchester, for example, where that's meant that every politician in the room has been a Labour politician because all the councils were Labour-led. We've consciously kept balance, but obviously that then does tend to lead to you getting 2 members from Bradford and 2 members from Leeds because they're the largest councils. Although I think there has been a point in the past when one of the additional Conservative members was either Councillor Baines or Councillor Benton. I'm trying to recall, but obviously that is a little bit, it's a little bit arbitrary. I think the other point to say is that there's still an element in here where actually we are 1 amongst 5 rather than proportionately less so, because there are elements of this where the veto, and this is where I'll bring Ian in, there are some elements which specifically require either a unanimous vote or a specific proportion of the leaders rather than of all the members, precisely to represent that point you say about balancing the voice between the smaller and larger areas. But I'll just bring Ian in to see if I've got that right. Again,
Eddie, you have, and I think it's important to remember that the the membership arrangements for the mayoral combined authority really do just reflect the current arrangements for the combined authority with the addition of the mayor. So that's the only change that's being made to the proposal. It's the addition of the mayor. The existing arrangements for the combined authority, which have been in place since 2014, will effectively overlap with the mayoral combined authority. As you said, Leader, the votes are unweighted. So the vote that the Calderdale nominated a member of the combined authority will have the same weight as the member from Leeds, subject to the political balance position, which is a point that's been well made, and that's something that will have to be resolved, obviously subject to the current standing of the parties across West Yorkshire following the election in May of 2021. You're also right, Leader, that there are situations where there needs to be both a vote which includes the vote of the mayor to take forward certain decisions, and where in fact there is a power of veto that's applied again in particular situations, which the detail of which is set out again in the scheme. So those are the governance arrangements which do reflect, as I said, the current arrangements with the addition of the mayor and adding that on. But I can give further information to members should they wish to have that over the next few days or weeks.
Thank you. So it is quite complex. It's a bit of a catch-22 because people will no doubt complain about the complexity, but the complexity is there because of that attempt to balance those many different interests. Finally, Councillor Baker, you asked if you could come in.
Thank you, Leader. Yeah, just a few things. I was quite pleased actually to hear you refer to it as a city deal, because I do think that is a more accurate way of describing it than devolution. If you look at the devolution that other kind of devolved assemblies or Scottish Parliament have, it covers a whole range of government functions, including housing, the environment, rural affairs, consumer advocacy. And actually what we're talking about here is quite a narrow set of powers around economic kind of regeneration. There's quite a big missed opportunity, I think, in terms of things like health devolution and housing devolution and rural affairs and environment devolution, where we could actually get real power into the hands of people living in the north of England to kind of shape their environment. And when you go out there on the streets, that's what people always say to you on the doorstep is, well, you know, whoever we vote for, things don't change, and we want people to have more power. They elect people, expect them to be able to make a difference. And you know, you quite often find that you get elected as a ward councillor, you actually have very little power. Even as a cabinet member, you'll find that you can only ever implement things if Whitehall gives you the funding tied to a particular kind of pilot scheme to actually do something that you might want to do. And I'm sure, you know, as cabinet members, you often find this yourself. So it is quite limited in the scope, this city deal. And even when you look at the gain share funding, I mean, it's 38 million a year, but when you split that between 5 authorities, even if we were to get an equal part of that, and as Calderdale being the smaller authority, that might be unlikely, that's about roughly kind of 7.5 million. When you look at our funding revenue, I think it's around over 200 million, isn't it? It only works out about 3.5% of our current funding. So actually in terms of the difference it's going to make to Calderdale, I think it is quite limited in its scope. Nonetheless, I think you are right that you have to go for it, because it is all that there is on the table. And you know, repeatedly people across Yorkshire have asked for that regional wide devolution, and it's been refused by the government. And repeatedly people have asked for better governance structures, to pick up on some of the points that Councillor Carter was raising, and we've been repeatedly told that no, you have to have the mayoral model. So that's kind of where we're at the moment, and it's always better to take something you can get than not have it at all. So that was kind of the more general comment of that. And I think I'd probably echo some of Councillor Carter's concerns about perhaps Calderdale getting missed out here, because it is a kind of city deal, yet we've got 3 cities in that region, Wakefield, Bradford and Leeds, who are going to be vying for power. Wherever the mayor is from, they're going to have some natural inclination to their home city, and they're going to have a real challenge to actually represent all of West Yorkshire, and especially some of the smaller towns who we know have got their own very distinct geographic characteristics and personalities. But just a couple particular points. One, looking at the consultation, it didn't really say very much about the scrutiny function. It said it might change, but there wasn't any potentials of how that scrutiny function would change to meet the needs of scrutinising the new mayor within it. Currently, there's just one overview and scrutiny committee on the combined authority, and there's some discussions around whether we need more than the one scrutiny panel. You know, ourselves and Calderdale Council, we have different scrutiny panels and boards because of, you know, the amount of work you need to cover and to do that work justice and detail. So I think perhaps we need to think about that and how we can strengthen the scrutiny function. So that was one of my questions about what your thoughts were around improving scrutiny on the combined authority. And secondly, I'm aware, you know, the consultation is going to go out. We're going to do our best to do it within the pandemic. We're going to be sending out letters and doing things for Facebook advertising and what have you. Will that consultation be done kind of neutrally from chief executives rather than any of the political leaders? Because I think it's really important with a topic like this that it isn't party political. It's done on a real kind of neutral basis. So will those kind of letters that are going through people's letterboxes come from, you know, chief executive, or who will they be from that consultation? Thank you.
Last point first, that's a very good question. I don't know the answer. I don't know whether Ian does. I do know that the feeling was that a lot of the consultation materials should come out from councils rather than from the combined authority, because it was more likely to get, frankly, people were more likely to pay attention and to that, and you know, people still don't always recognise the combined authority as a brand. I'll bring Ian in on that point at the moment. On the scrutiny side, yeah, I think that's probably a bit of a, the fact there's not more details on that is a bit of a victim of pressures on time at the moment, and I do agree it needs pushing and thinking through some more. At the moment, we've got a rather, you look across the combined authority as a whole, we've got a kind of rather hybrid sort of system where we've got a scrutiny, we've got panels which are kind of joint between the combined authority and the LEP, which are a mix of generally leaders or cabinet members, but also private sector voices, and which are probably technically advisory. We've then got a number of subcommittees, and of course we've got the Transport Committee, which is really very much, you know, feels more like kind of a traditional council committee, and with the mayor having transport powers, I can't see that isn't going to change. So, and I think there's probably an opportunity for people involved in the scrutiny function at Wicker to push some proposals forward on that to make sure it proceeds at pace. You know, speaking for myself, I would certainly want to make sure that the number of non-cabinet members involved in the different structures doesn't reduce, whatever the changes. And of course, if policing comes in, there's also the issue of the police and crime scrutiny panel as well. So certainly those there. Wider issue about devolution, I think we're on probably broadly similar lines there. I suppose the other point I'd make, you know, as a final one, which is not strictly written into the rules, but which matters to me, is that, you know, we resist mission drift, that, you know, the role of the combined authority should be clearly to do things that can't be done locally, and it shouldn't start taking things on. You know, there's a good parallel with the West Yorkshire and Harrogate partnership, which around health and care, which actually does have some very clear principles for deciding when and where it is appropriate to do things at a West Yorkshire and Harrogate level rather than locally. And I've argued, and will continue to argue, that we need to have the same kind of principles with Wicker. And we have generally resisted any suggestions that the mayor or the combined authority should take on local authority powers. There are one or two areas where it makes sense for those powers to be held jointly around some highways things. The one exception to that, which the government were insistent on, is the potential to have a regional strategic framework. But again, that is quite constrained in that any agreed framework would have to have the approval of all the individual councils. So it's again quite finely balanced. Ian, is there anything else you want to pick up there that I've not covered? I think it's that point about how the consultation is presented.
Yes, thank you, Leader. The West Yorkshire Combined Authorities comms team has been working very closely with all of the West Yorkshire internal comms teams. So the consultation process, whilst it is coordinated by Wicker, will be one that's undertaken individually by local authorities. So our comms team, which is part of the the Chief Exec's department will be responsible for sending out the communication, so it will be badged in accordance with the way in which we normally consult through our internal comms team.
Okay, thank you. So, so I thought at the start this might go through in about 5 minutes, but actually I think it's quite helpful. We've had some questions and comment on it because, you know, at the end of the day, this, although this is one stage in the process, this is a pretty significant change for West Yorkshire, and it's, you know, hard to yet see what the long-term impact might be. But if I can bring the debate to close now, I'll formally move the recommendations, which are set out in 3, and perhaps I can invite a seconder for those.
And I second that, Leader.
Thank you, Jane. So from Cabinet members, can I see all those in favour? That's unanimous. Thank you. So thank you very much for your contributions, everybody, and I'll declare the meeting closed.